Thank you, Neil, and thank you everyone for coming along this evening. It's great to be here. It's very special, I think, for an Australian poet to travel this far and for my poems to be this far away from home. Schiffer, thank you for that beautiful reading, and thank you, Sinead and Claire, for hosting us as well. I'll just open with a poem. My father as a giant koi. My father is at the bottom of a pond, perfecting the art of the circle. He is guiding the mottled zeppelin of his body in a single unceasing turn, like a monorail running on greased steel, like an ice skater swerving on a blade. His scales are lava and ember, dappled with carbon. His tail a luxurious Japanese fan. He is so far beneath the green skin of duckweed, he cannot make me out, or I him. What he knows is shrinking into round facts, days like mossed stones, each the same weight. Spears of water hyacinth rising around him like jail bars, reek of peat. He has been down there for years, ancient god of the dark, keeper of the single koan. Moving in currents only he can sense, fluent as a windsock. He surfaces 3 times a day when the nurse brings a tray, cold blanched carrot and beef, white sauce fillet of whiting, pound cake. He cannot trust the scratched headlamps of his eyes, so he navigates by feel, angling his huge whiskered head, mouth first towards the fork, weaving like an adder, charmed by smoke. Then he bites down to find the world suddenly there again, solid as metal and bait. So I'll say a little bit about the book. My father had Parkinson's, as Neil mentioned, for 20 years, and it took me the better part of 20 years to work out how to write about that in a poem, to work out what the poem might be for someone else in that experience. And of course, there were many, many moments of intense sadness. It's an intense trajectory watching someone you love decline in that way, watching someone in some ways lose their memories of you and who you are to each other. And of course, the temptation was to write a book of unrelentingly sad elegies. That's what we think of when we think of the elegy. But as anyone in the room who's watched a loved one go through those transformations and transfigurations, of course there are moments of sadness, but there are also moments of intense humour that ride alongside that. And one of them, it's funny now, it wasn't really funny at the time. So when we think of Parkinson's disease, we often think of people having difficulty with their mobility, having difficulty walking, maybe having a tremor. Those are the symptoms we know best. But a lesser known but apparently quite common symptom is compulsive spending, compulsive gambling. Fortunately, with my dad, it wasn't the case that it was that severe, but some people gamble away their entire life savings, their entire savings in the grips of Parkinson's, leaving a kind of nightmare for their family to deal with. In Dad's case, the spending was less severe than that. But around the time that we were having that very, very difficult, delicate conversation with him about it being just about time for him to give up his driver's licence. He was still very computer literate. He still knew how to buy things on the internet. And what he decided to do to rebel against that decision, without discussing it with anyone, without telling my mother, he bought himself a vintage Jaguar car on eBay. Sight unseen, untest driven, and it was delivered to a house on the back of a semi-trailer, and that was the first my mother knew of it. The Jaguar. It shone like an insect in the driveway, iridescent emerald, out-of-season Christmas beetle, metallic flecks in the paint like riverbed tailings, squeaking doe-skin seats. Bottle green, my father called it, or else forest. A folly he bought without test driving. Vintage 1980 XJ, a rebellion against his tremor. The sole bidder, he won the auction without trying, the day after the doctor told him to draw a line under his driving years. My mother didn't speak for weeks. It gleamed on the terracotta drive, Wildcat forever lunging on the hood, predatory, the chrome snagging in the sun, ornament of my father's madness, miraculous and sleek. Until he started to tinker, painted the leather seats with acrylic so they peeled and cracked, jacked the gear stick, hacked a hole into the dash with a Stanley knife, jury-rigged the driver's seat so it sat so low you couldn't see over the dash. For months, he drove it, even though my mother begged. He drove it as though he was punishing her, dangerously fast on the back roads, then opened up the engine on the highway, full throttle, even though he was going blind in one eye, even though my mother and I refused to get in. And for the first time in years, my father was happy. He was happy to be driving. He was happy my mother and I were miserable. Finally, his modifications killed it, the car he always wanted and waited so long to buy, and it sat like a carcass in the garage, like a headstone, like a coffin. But it's no symbol or metaphor. I can't make anything of it. Another of the more hilarious events, in retrospect, I hasten to add, these things weren't funny at the time. So I'm not really sure about the status of VAD. I think you don't have it here, voluntary assisted dying, in England, nor did we in Australia. It's slowly coming in, but as my father was dying, we didn't have it yet. And so in the absence of permission, you have these kind of couched conversations with doctors where you kind of can't quite come out and say what you're asking for, and they can't quite tell you what you're giving, what they're giving you, and the truth hovers kind of between the two of you. And of course, it's one of the most delicate, difficult conversations that you can have. And so my mother and I were very nervous about this. We weren't sure who we would get. When someone's dying in hospital, you get a different doctor every day, which is another kind of unknown factor. And we went in prepared to have this conversation, and unexpectedly, completely inappropriately, the doctor who came in that we were to ask this of was perhaps the most handsome man I've ever seen in my life. And it's not what you expect in that situation. And my mother has always been partial to a handsome man. And I heard her take a breath in, and I've always been partial to a handsome man, so I also took a breath in, and then we had to have this conversation. The kindest thing. The doctor, with an Armani model's jawline, is brisk when he tells me the kindest thing is to withhold antibiotics. Pneumonia is the old man's friend, he says. His stare so piercing, I feel compelled by his beauty. He is almost shining with charisma and vitality. This man who coaxes patients towards death like an emerald boa, stretching its pink jaw by inches, until the glass frog is entirely inside the snake's head, subsumed into the hypnotic knot of its body, its scales flexing electric green as new leaves, its white lightning bolts rippling and contracting. Or like the sinister musk blossoming of an orchid mantis, limbs variegated like bolotti beans in flecked rose and cream, swaying like a silken flower to lure the dreaming crickets in. The kindest thing is to hand yourself up to death's calling. I know this, but I am not handing myself up. I'm offering over my father, tenderly unhinging death's jaws until he is swamped with fever. His pupils tracking some invisible thread as he eases into unconsciousness. His eyes bright with the knowledge of one who senses he is being carried away, but does not know why or where. I'll read perhaps just one more of these quite intense father poems and then take you somewhere else, possibly to your great relief. Another deeply unexpected symptom of Parkinson's that Dad experienced that I'd never even heard of before was something called pathological crying. I don't know if anyone in the room has heard of this. It's a phenomenon that can happen to people with various forms of cognitive illness where they're crying without realising it. And you might be discussing something perfectly pleasant, you might not be talking about anything sad, and nonetheless the crying kind of washes over them like weather. And this was absolutely bizarre to see my father do this. My father was English, and I don't mean to generalise, but you're not renowned as the most emotionally demonstrative people in the world. And I'd never seen my father cry before in my life. And then all of a sudden he was crying kind of fluently, unprompted. And there was one subject that would reliably make him cry that didn't come up in conversation very often, but which Dad would bring up compulsively in conversation on his own, which was Winston Churchill. Which is both hilarious because it's very hard to kind of jam Winston Churchill into just ordinary day-to-day conversation. I'd be sitting with Dad at the aged care home having a cup of tea with him, and he'd bring up Winston Churchill and immediately make himself cry. It was like this little neural loop that he had, and on the one hand it was funny, on the other hand it was incredibly poignant because Dad had lost his own father during the war. Churchill was this kind of towering figure to him and many men of that generation, and his brain obviously had just kind of latched on to Churchill, and he kept bringing it up himself. So this poem is called Empires of Mind, and it takes its title from a phrase Churchill said in a speech that he gave at Harvard: the empires of the future are the empires of mind. Empires of Mind. Beside the fountain's troop of sun-bleached rubber ducks in the gardens under a shade sail, my father is crying about Winston Churchill. Midway through a lunch of cremated schnitzel, spoon-fed by the carer with the port wine stain, my father is crying about Winston Churchill. In the night, he cries out for Winston Churchill. During his morning bath, he cries for Winston Churchill. When the nurse does up his buttons, he will not stop his weeping. When the therapist wheels him to Tuesday piano, my father ignores the Mozart and cries for Winston Churchill. He cries not like a child seeking absolution, not like the mourner or the mourned, but free and unconstrained, as one who has spent a long time denying an urge and is suddenly giddy and incontinent in his liberation. The cleaners are unmoved. The woman who brings his hourly cup of pills is bright as a firework and goes about her round with the hardness of one who has heard all the crying in the world and finds in that reservoir nothing more disturbing than a tap's dripping drumbeat in a sink. But the night supervisor is frightened in the early hours when the halls ping with the sharp beep of motion sensors and my father's crying. His longing for silence is fierce and keen as a pregnant woman's craving for salt and fried chicken, as my father's crying for Winston Churchill. And the women in their beds call for it to stop like a Greek chorus, croaking like bullfrogs, each to each in the dark, unsettled, loud, insatiable, the unutterable fear rippling through them like a herd of horses, apprehending the tremor of thunder on a horizon they cannot see but feel. Let's go somewhere else. I'm going to read you a couple of love poems. I'm sadly not very good at writing love poems. I'm great at writing end-of-love poems, or as I like to think of them, searing indictments. So I'll read one of these to you now. I mean, that's the power of being a poet. You don't get many powers, but the one thing you do get is the final say on a relationship in print. So I'm going to read this poem, which is about an experience that is something direct out of a rom-com that happened to me, and in real life was kind of a horror story. I'd broken up with a partner. I'd moved to New York. We hadn't spoken to one another in 8 months. No contact. And this person, without asking me, without discussing it, decided to fly to New York and propose to me, which looks great on film and in real life is just an unmitigated horror show. The proposal. He swore he understood it was over. Then he flew to New York to propose. First I knew was when he called me from the arrivals hall. I could hear announcements booming, the chatter of passengers who had dozed beside him as he thumbed the velvet capsule of his fat, half-carat secret. I could hear families trundling luggage and shrugging on coats around him. I could see him standing with his duffel in the centre, rock in a fast-moving river. Soon he would be speeding towards me on Riverside, his cheek pressed to winter glass, skin oiled by the long flight. When he arrived, his face was from another life. His voice was like a 70s sitcom, suffocatingly nostalgic. I remember my dread as we sat under Sarah Beth's homely green awning. I remember his tears falling, when the waitress brought us a basket of muffins, pumpkin, strawberry. I remember the heat as I bit in, pure, searing. I watched him eat his eggs. I leaned back in the farmhouse chair. I hated him for making me say it. No, I would not marry him. No, I would never. After, we walked in the park. Sky the frostiest blue, cardinals like red bombs in bare limbs. The reservoir frozen over, snow mounded on the verges. You're so hard, he told me. He said it like an indictment, as if presenting proof of something I did not know. But I already knew, and I did not rise to object, because I praise whatever it is in me that is stony and unbending. I praise my hardness. To it, and it alone, I say, I do. Okay, maybe one more love poem and then one to close. Do I have time for two more, Neil? Okay. All right, I'll read you a shorter love poem. One of my favourite things is to think through a metaphor to its end point. I think often as poets and writers, we use metaphors, and I do it myself. You use them as sort of brief flashes of illustration in a poem. But there's something to me quite hilarious about really, really thinking a metaphor through to its end. So this is a love poem that does that. It's called Parable of the Clubhouse. When it ended, he said I had never let him in, as if I were a country club with a strict dress code. And he'd been waiting outside all those years without his dinner jacket, staring in at the gleaming plates of lobster thermidor, scores of waiters in forest green blazers, and the stout, square shoulders of other men who alternated tweed and seersucker over the seasons, silver cloches ringing them in at dinner like bells. So I said, maybe you're right. Maybe that's how it is. When you wanted a table, I was always full. When you want a table in the future, I'll be full then too. I'm booked out permanently. And no, you can't borrow a coat. You have to bring your own. That's our policy. Okay, I will read one more poem to close. I really should read you a Queensland poem. I'm from Queensland in Australia. I'm from a ludicrously named place called Surfers Paradise. That is the real name of the place. It's a beautiful part of the world. It's subtropical. It's sunny, muggy, hot all the time, and a great place to grow orchids. And my grandfather had a really green thumb and had a fantastic little kind of orchid shack that he'd built himself with just that green kind of sheeting, meshy sheeting you can buy at garden shops and sort of metal poles and stuff. And orchids, when you see them en masse, they're kind of quite eerie. They've got all these tendrils. They kind of grow into the air. And if you leave them alone and they're in a happy environment, more of the orchid is kind of outside the pot than in it. And it was a lovely little eerie space as a child to go and sit and look at these incredible plants. The orchid house. Pegged under banana trees, our backyard hothouse was fixed summer that boiled all year. A green humpy, breathing gauze in meshy sheets. Indoors it poured artificial rain. Under that slatted sunlight, I crept the spider-heavy shelves where exotics festered in their Latin names. I talked the twist wires tight round each trumpeting neck, chivied long legs from potted dark, as outside the clouds blew back like years. My grandfather spoke a strange pidgin there, knew cat's face from Queen of Sheba, snake flower, soldier's crest, sulphur tail. A decade late, I found a wrinkled block of newsprint under the orange crucifix. 6 men waist deep in the Mekong, where the war's end could never come. Death never reached those suburbs, not really. Bodies in their Sunday best never lay on our kitchen table, stiff as celluloid dolls. And last goodbyes were told by nurses in chemical code. When Grandad died, the wonky shack grew wild and creepers curtained over. Through walls thin and threadbare, I heard them hissing, the cold, wet tendrils that could strangle and grew on air. Tea tree, tangleroot, tongue. Thank you.